Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. In this episode, we speak with Karen Raghavan, a brand and business development consultant and growth advisor to both heritage beauty brands and startups. She is also the vice president of brand development at Purissima, a natural ingredient company. We kick off the discussion exploring the dynamic between heritage brands and startups operating in the same vertical, then moving on to discussing how consumption patterns for Chinese consumers can change when shopping abroad. We discuss the changes the pandemic has brought to beauty brands and their marketing, as well as the overall impact it has had on the retail environment. Karen also dives into what brands should consider when looking at KOLs and KOCs and why it's important to market your hero products versus your entire suite. We then dive into one of her passion projects, VIPKid, an education platform addressing the pressure cooker environment around academic expectations Chinese parents have of their children, ending with a comparison of the American and Chinese school systems and how well they prepare our young for their professional adult lives. Enjoy.
The quality of the KOL or KOC that you may be targeting may not be the ones that you actually want. So you may get a lot of volume, but not a lot of quality. One neat trick is to look at the KOL and KOC on a global scale. Not all Chinese KOL or KOCs may reside in China. So this is something that I like to talk to a lot of my clients about, which is looking at the Chinese on a global basis. Where do they reside and whether they're influential to your end consumer in China or not.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Karen, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
All right, a quick introduction to yourself, if you don't mind. Tell us a little bit about where your experience in and your expertise on China comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in beauty for pretty much over 20 years, most of my career, doing roles in global travel retail, as well as international business development for a lot of big, what they call heritage brands, as well as most recently, a lot of startup brands that are looking to enter China. I spent 4 years overseas in Singapore running the Southeast Asia market, and then 2 fast and furious years working on a big China project for LVMH at Benefit Cosmetics a couple of years ago. And now I work with a lot of startup founders on entry strategy into China. So staying really close to a market that's near and dear to my heart. I love it because it's so fast moving and ever changing and very intellectually challenging. So really happy to discuss China with you today.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we can't wait to get into that. Would you mind quickly indulging me? What is a heritage brand?
Well, nowadays I hear that this name has been attributed to the Estee Lauders and the L'Oreal brands of the world. P&G brands, Unilever. So I believe from, how people are using it in the industry these days are sort of the legendary brands that are big, the behemoths, I like to call them, that are definitely being threatened by a lot of fast growing, clean, sustainable, green beauty brands that are cropping up in the space, who are offering definitely a different value proposition to the customer. So I think that there is a very interesting change and shift in the landscape where a lot of big brands that have dominated the beauty industry for decades are having to relook at their product and marketing strategy in order to face off against some of these newer and very attractive startup beauty brands.
That's interesting. Do you find that there is any overlap between heritage brands and startup brands and products, are they swimming in the same space at all? Are they able to work together? Are they connected? Are they communicating? Are startups engaging the heritage brands to be able to run some proof of concept stuff, potentially supported or sponsored by the heritage brands? Or are they just staying far apart from each other?
Well, I think in the M&A space, we're seeing a lot of activity in terms of the big conglomerates snapping up some of the smaller brands that they see that have basically captured on this opportunity. I think they're very smart. Instead of devoting resources internally and trying to shift a massive ship, they are instead buying up some of these smaller brands in order to capture that potential. So I do think that they are paying attention. I think that they probably moved a lot slower than they should have. I think a lot of the product development that has gone on for a few years now didn't really jump on the bandwagon in terms of listening to consumers' demand for more ingredient transparency, more clean or natural ingredients, and the whole sustainability shift. I think a lot of the brands, the heritage brands, really just were sitting back, I think, a little bit and feeling a little too safe and too comfortable with the level of volumes that they're able to bring on. And so I think they now are probably having to really jump on that sort of opportunity via acquisition versus, or maybe in parallel to a lot of internal reshifting.
When you were with Benefit Cosmetics, your area of focus was the, and I'm air quoting this, Chinese travelers abroad, which is a consumer segment that we know is super influential in the retail world, but not one that we've been able to get into on this podcast yet. Can you help us understand, do consumption patterns for Chinese consumers change when they are traveling versus when they're at home in their home market, in their home base? How and why is that the case?
Yes, actually, this is a very interesting area of study and research that I did at Benefit Cosmetics. Everybody is obviously chasing the China market and have been for years. And obviously, a lot of the newer brands are really chasing that opportunity with the rise of the e-commerce business and landscape in recent years with, Alibaba, JD, et cetera. But even 5 years ago, with a big quote unquote heritage brand such as like a Benefit Cosmetics, the China market wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't an easy business to run. Growth obviously was challenging, as well as capturing the attention span and awareness of the Chinese consumer. There's a lot of competition, a lot of brands entering the market. So we looked at basically what it is that captures the minds of Chinese consumers. And right around that time, we were noticing that obviously the travel retail business boomed, and in certain markets, a great proportion of travel retail doors business went to Chinese consumers. So we noticed that there are a lot of Chinese consumers that go to Korea, Southeast Asia, et cetera, to travel. Right, the middle class was growing. They were starting to garner more wealth. And through that, through their travels, they were starting to find brands and products that they were bringing back home to share with them, with their friends and family, and to capture the price differential. It's a significant, back then it was a much bigger price differential where some brands could be offering their prices 30 to 60% above what the home market price was. So we did some studies. It took about a year to really take a look at what Chinese consumers were doing overseas. So one, they were starting to not travel necessarily with the tour groups. So I'm sure many of the listeners have seen historically the massive buses with the big tour groups and sort of the flags, right, where there's a tour guide leading groups of people into shopping malls. They were, with the rise of the newer generation, they were looking at traveling more independently. So kind of the acronym is FITs. And these independent travelers were booking their own travel, doing their own research, and being a little bit more courageous and adventurous in terms of where they were looking to go. And they were looking to, perhaps go to places that friends and family don't historically go to. With the rise of social media, it was also a big competition in terms of who can, go to the far-reaching places or never sort of the lesser traveled paths in order to post videos and photos on social media. So we looked at a lot of this behavior, and the younger generation were going overseas, making their shopping lists before they even traveled. So they had a very intentional shopping behavior as opposed to non-Chinese travelers who may go abroad, go and visit a couple of stores or shopping districts and decide impulsively what they might want to travel. Well, the Chinese have a very intentional purchasing behavior where they will research the brands at length, research the products at length, research the pricing at length, and then mock up a list per location, per destination, and even do a group buy, right? So if I'm going overseas, I'm going to go out to my friends and family and say, I'm going to be visiting San Francisco. I'm going to be visiting New York or London. And I'm going to go and look for these brands who would like some of these products. And so that shopping list is extremely aggressive and very comprehensive. And so we definitely saw that through some of our research.
Do you think that the Chinese travelers were making destination decisions based on stuff that they might want to buy versus buying stuff from the places that they were going?
Not necessarily. I think that there were certain locations that were easy access. So Korea, extremely easy to access. And also with all of the Korean dramas, K-beauty, all of those trends obviously contributed to the desires to head to Korea. Southeast Asia obviously is another easy to access destination. I think the far-reaching destinations such as Australia or Europe or US, those were probably fewer in terms of numbers based on the time away that they would need to spend, right? Because you need at least a week or more to get overseas to Europe or the US, Canada, Australia. But a lot of the travel happened, I would say, regionally. So I would say that a lot of their destination decisions was, decided based on the time that they had in terms of vacation and access, as well as some of the cultural phenomenon that were circling around the market at that time, such as like the K-beauty and the Korean dramas.
Did those consumption patterns change based on the region of the world they were traveling to and things like how long it might take to get there or customs or language or any of that?
Oh, 100%. For sure that they spent more in hotel and airline tickets when they traveled abroad. There were some data that pointed directionally to a more experiential spend when they traveled farther overseas. The shopping, obviously, in terms of brands differed. There are a lot of brands that they could see overseas that weren't offered regionally. And there was a rise in a pricing comparison platform. I don't know if you've heard of Jessica's Secret. This app was launched probably around 2014, 15, or 16. I regret that I don't know the exact launch date of this app, but when I was doing research, I discovered it. And it was launched by a Chinese founder. And basically, they managed to scrape all of the pricing across many different points of sales distribution around the world. So if you logged into this app, you could see the different prices for the products or brands that you were looking to buy and could make a decision in terms of where you might want to buy it based on that price. So if you're heading to Korea and then San Francisco, for example, maybe your stop off in Korea, you're thinking, I'm going to buy this brand and this product, but maybe upon further research within an app like Jessica's Secret, you may think, okay, wait a second, I see a lower price in San Francisco DFS, and decide to postpone your purchase. So there's actually a lot of different contributing factors to how the Chinese decided to change their purchase decisions and purchasing behavior.
Could you juxtapose the traveling Chinese consumer to the traveling Western consumer, just in what those consumption patterns might be? How do they differ and how are they similar?
Yeah. So I believe that the Western consumer, we're looking for that experience, and things change so quickly in China that this research that I'm referencing is about 5 years old, and there are some studies or some qualitative reports now that show that the Chinese are shifting their traveling patterns, meaning that they are gearing toward more experiential type of experiences versus just purely a shopping trip. So I think that the Western consumer or the Western traveler has always traveled primarily for that experience, right? I'm not looking to go to Paris because I could buy that luxury handbag at a cheaper price than if I were to purchase it at Saks or Neiman Marcus in my home market, right? But there are signs that the Chinese consumer are kind of paring back their shopping because they are looking at the experience bit a little bit more, putting more weight toward that experience now. So I do believe that, especially with the Gen Zs and the younger generation, that the experiential bit and sort of the social media cred that they get, right, when they're posting overseas. Hey, I've gone to Banff in Canada, or I've gone skiing in whatever resort, or I'm doing something, a new activity that I'd like to share with my friends and family, is starting to take a little bit more precedence than look at this amazing new, product or exclusive brand that I was able to access overseas. I mean, I think that shopping pattern still exists, but I do already see within 5 years' time that there is already a shift that is starting to happen.
Do most beauty brands of a certain size need to have a dedicated Chinese traveler program? I know Benefit Cosmetics had one under your leadership. Can you tell me what the program looked like while you were there? What you think a modern dedicated Chinese traveler program needs to look like in 2022, assuming a return to somewhat normal travel after post-COVID, or even during a slowdown of COVID in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I don't think there needs to be a specific Chinese traveler program anymore. I believe that a lot of brands have gotten way more educated over the last few years on the China market and the Chinese consumer. I think when I first started, there was a separation between that Chinese consumer who everyone just visualizes being in the China borders, and not realizing that the Chinese consumer is actually a global consumer. And I can touch upon a little bit about the Chinese overseas population, right? We're talking about the Chinese traveling consumer right now who lives in China and then goes overseas to have vacations and then going back home. But within this sort of demographic, there is also an overlap with the overseas Chinese population who have emigrated to other countries around the world and still remain extremely influential brand ambassadors to their friends and family network back home in China. So just to kind of address the question regarding Chinese traveling programs, I think COVID accelerated a little bit of that. So when we started looking at how do we communicate with that Chinese traveler better across our different points of distribution, right? We have to reach them where they are. So at that time, we were designing a WeChat CRM program so that we would be able to communicate brand story, brand messaging, product newness, any sort of, engaging content that may actually stem beyond our products specifically. So, maybe a little bit more about San Francisco, where Benefit Cosmetics is headquartered, and a little bit more about traveling around the US so that we could engage the consumer at a much higher level than just, pounding her with product messaging. We also looked at putting QR codes everywhere where we thought that she would visit. So testing testing out QR codes within our boutiques, QR codes on our gondolas and travel retail locations. And I have to be honest, at that time, it was very unusual, very new. It took a lot of even internal convincing, because people were like, okay, in the US, like QR codes are dead. Like nobody uses them. What are we doing here? And so I think that sort of perspective has vastly sort of gone 180 now. And I think actually the pandemic spurred a little bit more of that sort of omni-channel user experience a little bit more, where people are realizing, wait a second, these QR codes are amazingly efficient, and it provides a much more seamless experience. And it's not just for the Chinese travelers, for any sort of consumer now, right? So when I think back to the sort of conversations I had with the teams that I was working with in terms of what a significant, improvement to the customer experience a QR code could provide. Fast forward 5 years now, and I see QR codes everywhere. I see them on product packaging. And that was something that I really wanted to convince the brand to do, was to put a QR code on the box so that people could say, wow, I'm going to scan this and it'll go directly to a Chinese PDP, and that way the consumer can immediately read in her own language what that product is all about, or having a QR code right on the table in a store next to the display, so the Chinese who may or may not be English proficient or fluent could still research that product or brand in her own language, right, after scanning a QR code. So I actually think that a lot of the retail experiences have been well improved to be able to address the Chinese. I mean, a lot of the QR codes now may direct to English informational pages, but it's very easy to kind of switch that over to a Chinese page. And even if it's an English page, it's still a much improved experience for that Chinese customer who may be fluent enough to be able to read the English, but not be able to understand if a beauty advisor were to speak to her.
How else do you think COVID has impacted or changed either travel or beauty products, beauty brands, beauty marketing, the development of both? Can you quickly just speak to that?
Yeah, I think that obviously the e-commerce weight in terms of a mix of business has drastically increased. I think that there's a lot more pressure and demand to be able to feed really compelling content and brand messaging to that consumer via their own DTC, via their social media, through influencers, through brand partnerships. I just think that even though it seems like it's easier to reach that customer, I think it's actually quite challenging because there's only so much space within a phone or a laptop to be able to compete with the hundreds of thousands of other brands that are trying to reach that same customer, as opposed to where you're, seeing the traffic come through your stores and your brick and mortar experiences, right? We're still human beings at the end of the day. So having somebody talk me through a compelling brand story or demonstrating how a product actually could, solve some of my skin problems or some of my makeup needs. It's hard to compare that with, an Instagram ad or even somebody showing me how to do it on TikTok. So I think that it has accelerated the demand for better digital experiences, but I do believe it also has put pressure on how to integrate that with the in-store experience. At some point, I have full faith that this pandemic will wane, or COVID will become endemic and we will have to learn how to live with it, and people will return to their normal lives and they will seek experiences. I mean, people obviously are already hungering to meet up with friends and family and go and dine out or go to bars. And fundamentally, we're social creatures. So I think that integration between the in-store experience and the digital experience will have to basically come together a lot more seamlessly. And so for those brands who were primarily brick and mortar and was entering digital, or for the DTC native brands who are looking to branch into brick and mortar spaces to offer their customers more of a in-person personal experience, I think there's going to be a learning curve on both sides.
All right. One last question, staying on the beauty topic and the cosmetics topic. How did COVID in that world impact retail?
I think that it showed that there could be a lot of brands that can have a lower barrier to entry. So it just seems very it was like the perfect storm with COVID. In fact, there were a lot of people that launched their businesses and brands. And I think actually the barrier to entry in terms of starting your own brand has been vastly lowered, and it's much easier to do so. Where I think it remains to be seen is how to scale those brands and to extend the longevity of these brands. So I think it's really optimistic of a trend to see that, wow, there are many founders now that can realize their dream and their vision in terms of offering the products that they want to offer to the consumers, because these are so many DTC native brands that have shown success and that can show success. But what I think is still that remains to be seen is how that extends into the future. And again, how does that translate into a larger distribution strategy? How does that translate into expanding globally? So that's one thing that I find extremely interesting and fascinating, is just sort of seeing how this landscape will play out with so many brands launching and competing against each other, and seeing who sort of wins at the end in terms of being able to stay sustainably successful.
Talking about beauty space in China, and everyone knows about KOLs and KOCs and live streaming and their impact on the beauty space, especially e-commerce wise in China. But there are a couple of tactics. I would like to ask you, do you know, or could you mention potentially a couple of tactics that are emerging as particularly effective, but maybe a bit under the radar? Not everybody knows them. And as we kick off 2022, talk about those and how they're driving growth in the beauty space in China.
Yes, I think the KOL topic is a tough nut to crack. I think everybody knows that that's the hot word to go to. It's actually probably going to be a lot pricier than many brands anticipate. So let's talk about KOLs or KOCs even. So key online consumers, right? Or the influencers. I think they're all doing the same thing. They're just at different levels. I think one of the biggest key criteria that we look at, or we should be looking at, is the quality of that KOL or KOC. There is no get rich quick or scale quick when it comes to any type of influencers. Again, we're all humans at the end of the day. We need to build that relationship, whether it's at the KOL level or the KOC level, to really build that relationship with them. Make sure that the story about the brand and the key points of differentiation of whatever products you may be seeding them is 100% clear, and that they're on board with the products that they're receiving. I do know that there are some platforms out there that purport to have some sort of algorithm. You can scale the seeding very quickly. That is one way of doing it. It just may not be the best return on investment, because the quality of the KOL or KOC that you may be targeting may not be the ones that you actually want. So you may get a lot of volume, but not a lot of quality. One neat trick is to look at the KOL and KOC on a global scale. Not all Chinese KOL or KOCs may reside in China. And so this is something that I like to talk to a lot of my clients about, which is looking at the Chinese on a global basis. Where do they reside and whether they're influential to your end consumer in China or not? So looking beyond just China borders is something that I would definitely advise many brands looking to enter China or looking to build their presence online, is looking at where that Chinese user could be. And she may not necessarily, or he may not necessarily be residing in China. They could be overseas and highly influential on social.
I was wondering if you might indulge me in a small discussion of the benefits of highlighting hero products versus just your brands, whomever's listening, versus just highlighting your new products when entering China?
Yeah, so the hero product strategy is definitely something that's very different compared to how you might launch your products outside of China. I think outside of China, the sequence or the pace of new product innovation is definitely more pressurized, right? The consumer is constantly looking for that new product that the brand may be launching based on the seasons. Every single year, brands are definitely pressured, from my experience, to launch 2 to 4 new products, if not more, a year. And I'm probably referring more to skincare brands. I mean, makeup brands could be way more. But in China, the way to kind of get to that customer's heart is hero strategy. So focusing on a couple of key hero SKUs, because the competition is so fierce, the landscape is so saturated. How do you stand out amongst all of your competitors? And that is via hero product strategy. So not to say that newness isn't important to the Chinese consumer, but the hook is major hero products that they rely on, that they develop a loyalty with, and then introducing newness to that consumer who's already been hooked with your brand. So that is definitely a different way of attacking the customer demographic versus outside of China. And so hero product strategy is really key. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. So again, an extension also in terms of the KOL or KOC conversation, that quality bit is very, very important. The Chinese consumer is extremely savvy. She researches brands, ingredients, product benefits to a very high level. They are way more industrious about comparing different products and really digging into a lot of product claims, as opposed to what we see in terms of consumers outside of China. So building up that hero strategy and developing that brand loyalty via that, those few key products, and then extending into newness is sort of what we've seen to prove better success within China.
I want to now dive into VIPKid and, of course, your work there. But first, maybe could you tell us just a little bit about what is VIPKid?
Yeah, so VIPKid is a edtech platform. So a lot of people used to refer to it as sort of like the Uber for education, where it's a marketplace that connects teachers who could be living anywhere around the world with students who could be living anywhere around the world. And so it's an amazing platform that basically improves the access to education for kids, as well as empowering many, independent contractors to have a side hustle or maybe have more flexibility for their jobs. So there are all these teachers around the world that can log into this platform and offer their teaching services to children who may not have access to such qualified teachers. Now, the main demographic are children who live in China. And there are many, many cities in China beyond the tier 1 or tier 2 that people mostly read about. And it's very difficult for these children to have access to native English speakers if they wanted to learn Chinese. So, and even if there was an English school down the street, the parents would not necessarily be educated enough to know whether that school has employed certified teachers or even native speakers. So what VIPKid does is there's a huge team that vets all the teachers that apply to be teachers on that platform, inclusive of reviewing their diplomas or teacher certifications, in-person interviews. They have to go through trial lessons where they're being observed by a member of VIPKid staff before they are accepted as a teacher onto the platform. So there is, this huge vetting process that goes into place so that the users, so the parents and the families and the students feel very confident that they are going to be in a lesson with a teacher that has been fully vetted by the company.
What is it like being part of a team in the educational tech space? And I know that you work with startups quite a bit. You live in the Valley. We all know that it's a super interesting space and that even with COVID, it has grown tremendously. We know that Chinese parents invest a lot of resources in the education of their kids. Did that at all affect the way that you guys built that business?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the demand has always been there. And in fact, there has been an announcement by the Chinese government most recently that basically says that because of inequity, they are cracking down on a lot of these edtech companies. So the likes of VIPKid and their competitors have gone through quite a bit of challenges just in the recent months based on the Chinese government's announcement. But taking politics out of it, fundamentally, there is a lot of demand from Chinese families for their children to be able to get ahead, right? And that's part of the crackdown from the Chinese government, right? Because there's this pressure cooker on these students and families to kind of get ahead. Who can take more enrichment classes than their neighbor, right? Who can take more English classes? Who can take more math classes? The university exam is so stressful for these children, and it's a make or break type of life for them, which is completely unknown to the students here in the US. Like when I think about my children, right, they just need to get their grades, they go to school, but there aren't these examinations at key milestones in their little childhood that may determine their fate in life as it does in China. So all of these enrichment classes have always been in demand, and it's more about access and supply, right? So how do you, if these parents are working long hours, if the commutes are difficult in China, how to get children to the activities that they would want? And so with the online education business and the industry, it all of a sudden opened up a world of opportunities to these families to have access to classes for their kids who can log in from home at night, right? So after they come home from school or on the weekends, and be able to learn a topic or bolster their knowledge in certain topics online, and without the burden of having to travel to places or finding schools that may or may not have been vetted fully. So that, I think, is a huge it's a huge sort of revolution to kind of how to offer education. And we're seeing it here in the US as well, right? With all these different platforms that are offering online classes to kids that may not be able to have access in an actual school environment or location. So it's definitely the future. Don't know how it's going to play out in terms of how the government will handle such enrichment classes, but there are plenty of global companies and companies that are based outside of China that are definitely capitalizing on this opportunity.
Have you seen a change being in the education space, working with kids and obviously their parents as well, your client-customer kind of relationship? Have you felt that maybe there's been a changing of the guard with regards to the importance and the level of intensity on which education is put at the forefront? And I know that I think the government is starting to work to help that along by reducing the number of subjects that are required for national testing or for Gaokao scoring or kind of this kind of thing. I wanted to just kind of open up a bit of a general conversation around where you think parents with regards to their kids' education and that intensity is it waning? Is it waxing? Where's that going?
I think unless there's a structural change in how children and students enter university, that pressure cooker environment will remain. And that is just sort of my opinion. And we see microcosms of that around the world too, right? So even within the US, in highly competitive schools, you will see that sort of race amongst families and students to, right, have the best college application, to set themselves up for the best entrance into a college or university. I just think it's a lot, it's magnified within China because of the sheer population and the sheer number of schools per that population, which is why sort of what you see is a lot of wealthier families do have the ability to alleviate some of that pressure and send some of their students overseas for school. But for those who can't afford to leave or don't want to leave, that pressure cooker will remain based on supply and demand. So I believe that culturally too, that it's not just the Chinese. I believe that Chinese, I think it's just, again, based on pure population, the migration patterns, the Chinese population have emigrated all around the world. And that sort of cultural focus on education and the strive to ensure that their students are succeeding will, sort of like spread as the immigration patterns evolve. But there are many other demographics that feel exactly the same about education. And I think it's just that because there has been this need and the likes of VIPKid were able to break out with a model that showed that there can be access offered to students who otherwise would not have access. I think that is an example of a pioneer into changing and just really revolutionizing the online education industry. So I mean, unfortunately, I think that sort of pressure cooker mentality will remain for the near future unless there's massive structural changes. And I think the pandemic, with the rise of mental health awareness and wellness focus, and how our children are suffering from the whole pandemic and all of the uncertainty and obviously the sort of chaotic lifestyles that have ensued based on, staying at home and remote learning, returning to school, then coming back home because of positive COVID cases. I actually see a silver lining in the cloud, because from my observations, it has shown that education doesn't necessarily have to be one singular model. It's not necessarily everybody has to be in school in a classroom, for a set number of hours per day, and that there can be opportunities for hybrid models to exist and succeed. There can be ways for children to maximize their learning that isn't necessarily in person. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be. I think that the in-person learning is extremely critical, but I do see that basically this pandemic has shown us that education can evolve to become many different types of models, and that in fact the online learning is giving access to kids all around the world in terms of topics or exposure to different types of teachers beyond what anyone would have been able to envision prior to the pandemic.
Do you think that today's traditional education systems, either in China or in the US, are doing an adequate job of setting kids up to be successful in the workforce and as adults?
And I think that's country specific. Would you like me to weigh in on US or China?
Yes, I would love to hear your opinion on both sides of the ocean.
So I would think in the US, it's very difficult. I think that as a mom of 3 children, a working mom at that, I think it's really difficult because of the lack of childcare. And there's a lot of controversial, obviously, conversations about universal pre-K, et cetera. But when I compare that to the average working professional in China or in Asia, where they have different family living situations, right? People in the West tend to live on their own, single units. Multi-generational living is probably atypical, and single family living is way more typical. So you have 2 parents, or a single parent, maybe even looking after their children without much of a network to assist them with childcare. Whereas in Asia or Asian families overseas may have a higher propensity to have multi-generational living to support that working parent or that set of working parents. So I think because of that, children's education is definitely shortcut. I would say it's sacrificed a little bit in the early years because of that lack of support from the top. Whereas I believe in China or in Asia, because you have a lot more support, whether it is affordable help or multi-generational living where you have grandparents or other relatives around to help you watch your children or to send them to school, that gives much more of, I think, of a bigger advantage in terms of how the children are receiving their education and support outside of school. So I think there's some huge fundamental differences. And as an Asian American, I can see that difference very, very personally. I grew up basically with a grandma in the home. My parents worked 6-7 days a week, and they were able to go out and make a living and perform their livelihoods because they didn't necessarily have to worry about us at home with somebody watching over us 24/7, 7 days a week. So that's, and, it wasn't, we were very much lower to middle class, but I don't know how we would have survived if we didn't have that sort of support at home. It would have been extremely hard on my parents. And likewise, it's extremely hard for those families who are in similar situations that may not have that sort of support at home. And that definitely influences the education, right? Whether people have to pay to have childcare or whether they are unable to have that sort of support at home. So somebody to say, make sure you're well fed, make sure you're doing your homework, make sure that you're getting to bed on time. So I think some of those even fundamental type of childcare can be lacking if we don't have the right support. So I think there's striking differences, and I think that really makes it a lot more challenging for the average student in the U.S. To have a large chance of success due to just the support and access to education that they may have within their own community, as opposed to maybe an average child within the same sort of socioeconomic status somewhere in Asia.
Karen Raghavan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciated getting to talk to you.
It was really fun for me, Todd. Thank you so much.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。